Hi everyone, my name is Joe McGrath and I'm the VP for EDI in the College of Social Sciences and Law. Welcome to our webinar for International Women's Day. We've quite an exciting panel discussion for you today on the theme Harnessing Narratives to Foster Inclusion. The panelists, Fiona McEntee, Katrina Palmer and Ivanna Bacik, have worked to elevate the rights of women and blaze trails in reproductive rights, climate change and of course refugee rights, which has particular resonance in light of the women and children displaced by armed conflict in the Ukraine and elsewhere at the moment. Due to political events, Ivanna is running late, but we will hook in with her later in the session. Fiona McEntee is an award-winning, nationally recognized immigration attorney. She is the founder and managing attorney of McEntee Law Group in Chicago. Fiona and her team of passionate advocates represent individuals and families, as well as the world's leading musicians, artists, athletes, innovative entrepreneurs, startups, and multinational and US companies. Katrina Palmer is the author of 2 best-selling books, the memoir An Affair with My Mother, A Story of Adoption, Secrecy and Love, and also Climate Justice, co-written with the former President of Ireland, Mary Robinson. A human rights investigator, advocate, journalist, and author, Katrina has drawn attention to the plight of people overlooked and marginalized through her work, with survivors of the Srebrenica massacre, survivors of historical abuse in Ireland, and in documenting the effects of climate change. We will also be joined later by Ivanna Bacik. Ivanna Bacik is the Labour TD for Dublin Bay South, barrister and Reid Professor of Criminal Law at Trinity College Dublin. She previously served as a Dublin University Senator. She's the Labour spokesperson for Climate, Children and Equality and chairs the Oireachtas Special Committee on Gender Equality. So in this session, we're going to explore how our speakers have harnessed the power of personal stories to transform them into compelling narratives to stimulate change and action. Before we begin, however, I'd like to hand you over to the acting college principal, Professor Niamh Moore-Cherry, who will kindly address the webinar. Over to you, Niamh.
Thanks very much, Joe, and good afternoon and welcome to all the participants on our webinar, to students, to staff, faculty, and to our alumni. Thank you so much to our guest speakers for giving their time today to address all of us, and I think it's going to make for a really exciting session. The College of Social Sciences and Law, as many of you will know, is committed to issues of equality, diversity, and inclusion. We value ourselves on tolerance, on openness, and on action towards change. And I think the 3 panelists today really speak to those values. Many of us, I think, feel very disempowered at the moment when we see situations like that in Ukraine and we see what's going on there. So I think what's really powerful and really important is to identify how we can take real and meaningful action. And I think our 3 panelists today show us how they've done that in relation to really pressing issues, as Joe has said, in relation to migration, climate justice, women's rights, and human rights more generally. And our college and our alumni are so well placed to address what are the major societal challenges of the 21st century. And we have a moral obligation, if you like, to use our knowledge and to use our expertise and our skills to help to address these issues. So I'm absolutely delighted to be able to welcome you all. I have a 10-year-old daughter and a 12-year-old son, and I already see gender issues emerging between the 2 of them. And in a house where we try and ensure that everybody has an equal voice, it's interesting that it's so important to remind ourselves all the time of that. So it's an absolute pleasure to welcome our speakers today and welcome all of you. And I'm just really excited to hear the discussion as it unfolds. So thank you.
Thank you, Niamh. So again, I'm very delighted to welcome our panelists today, Fiona and Katrina. They join us from the US, where it's particularly early, so we appreciate you taking the extra effort to be here. The first question is for you both, Fiona and Katrina. Can you tell us about your work for a few minutes, what it is you do, and why you believe it's important? Maybe we could lead with you first, Fiona, if that's okay.
Yeah, so good morning from Chicago. I'm really honored to be here with such amazing panelists and hosts. So thank you for having me. So I'm an immigration attorney and I run my own firm here in Chicago, practicing US immigration law. our firm is full service, so we do all types of immigration law. My particular expertise has been with startup entrepreneurs and kind of technology, O1 extraordinary ability visas. That's kind of my day-to-day, but I also am the media and advocacy chair for AILA, which is the American Immigration Lawyers Association. So that's the National Bar Association that has 15,000 immigration lawyer members. So I head up the Media and Advocacy Committee, and I think the theme of today's webinar really resonated with me, because a large part of what we do in AILA, but also us individually as immigration attorneys, is that we try to advocate for change through the use of storytelling and also giving, people a chance to share their own story. So it's not just us sharing on behalf of them, obviously with respect for confidentiality and things like that when we're talking to media, but finding a way to use our privilege, our position of privilege, to try to advocate for change. And I believe, and I've seen, that personal storytelling can be a really effective way to do that. So.
Thank you so much, Fiona. Katrina, if I could ask you the same question, if you could tell us a little bit about what you do and why you think it's important.
Thanks, Joe, and good morning to all from a windy Washington, D.C. It's wonderful to be here, and it's great to be with yourself and Fiona and Ivanna and Neve. Yeah, so I'm after, as you mentioned, Joe, a career in human rights investigations and journalism and advocacy. I'm in this sort of strange but happy and privileged position to call myself a storyteller. I hesitate to say writer. I mean, you'll see all the books behind me on the bookshelves. There are so many writers that I admire and revere, so I don't put myself in that category, but I cherish and revere stories. And as Fiona says, stories really, really matter. Writing has always informed my work. It's always been a really common thread from the very early days after I left UCD and went to the US to study, and then got a job in human rights. I was always with Physicians for Human Rights in Bosnia, writing stories about post-war Bosnia, the victims of the Srebrenica massacre. In my work with the War Crimes Tribunal in The Hague, I helped write a victim impact statement. So the women of Srebrenica who were so overlooked following that horrendous massacre could tell their stories in court, and more importantly, outline the impact that that terrible massacre had had on their lives and on their children's lives. As a journalist with the Irish Times in Iran and Iraq, I wrote stories about people left behind, people who've fallen through the cracks. So even though I've had these different careers, storytelling has always been a really major part of it. And that's what I intend to do moving forward. I just think stories matter. They're the very fabric of our lives. Each of us here and all of us listening in have an individual story to tell. And I think it's, no secret if I, raise my position as an adopted person in Ireland, the fact that I've been shut out from the facts of my own life through Ireland's very complicated history with adoption and with records. I think that's the reason that I've adopted storytelling as my rubric.
And Katrina, if I could stay with you for a moment on that, what would you say is the most rewarding and the most challenging aspect of the work that you do?
I think the most rewarding and the most unexpected was the joy and the love of writing. When I wrote my memoir, An Affair with My Mother, first of all, I didn't think that I could do that. I never thought I could write a book. It just seemed like an impossible ask. And Fiona, you may have that experience too. But then when I started investigating my own story and that of those who I profiled in the book, I just discovered this extraordinary joy of writing. And I loved how my brain felt when I was writing. And maybe you too, Joe, have had this experience, it's a very insular, very private experience, but I just loved, I loved the puzzling, the figuring out how to write and massage passages and structure the book. And I guess in terms of challenges, as I've mentioned, a lot of my writing is deeply personal. And I think a challenge is that it's just sometimes very uncomfortable to tell the truth. I was the first adoptee of my generation in Ireland to write a memoir. And that was deeply uncomfortable for many people when it came out. I was breaking some taboos about what it feels like to be adopted. Adoptees are generally people who are expected to feel nothing but gratitude for their position. And I was challenging some of that in the book. And there was a lot of pushback for that. So I think also, in terms of my book with Mary Robinson, confronting just such dreadful injustices, and obviously writing about those and elevating them, but just confronting what people who are living on the front lines of climate change have to deal with day in, day out. That's been a huge challenge.
And Fiona, if I could turn to you and ask you maybe the same question, what do you think is the most rewarding and the most challenging aspect of what you do?
Well, I mean, every day, we're dealing with people coming from different types of situations. I think the rewarding part of our job is getting to see the true diversity of the immigrants that come to the US, and really getting to just play a tiny bit of a role in helping them remain here and get an opportunity to, live out their American dream, whatever that may be. It's hugely rewarding for us. It's also very challenging. These are not always easy cases to win. It can be frustrating dealing with, just a lot of, kind of pushback maybe from the federal government, depending on what the situation is. We can be dealing with officers who don't thoroughly review cases, who ignore evidence that's been provided, and we have to, spend time filing additional responses. So there can be a lot of that back and forth. But I think knowing that, just being able to help people and being able to see, what they can accomplish on their own if they're just given an opportunity. I also, apart from like the individual cases, we in our team, we like celebrate the win. We have a celebrate the wins channel and we shout it out, and everybody gets to, just because you have to celebrate those wins, right? Because it's not an easy area of law to practice in. And I think if you don't take the joy where you can, you should do that, because you're not gonna, some days won't be as good as others. You need to take the time to celebrate that. Another kind of rewarding part of our job is I get to see, I think a lot of us immigration attorneys are optimists, I think, by nature. It's part of our values in our team. And I say it's hard to work in this area of law if you're not optimistic, and what that means for us is that we believe that the system can be better, and we try to make that happen. So we try to do things to advocate at a bigger level. And that's really important to me, because as much as helping individual cases is very important too, I think that there's a bigger picture advocacy piece here that we can really, really participate in and make change. And a couple of examples is, things like the US immigration law has not been updated by Congress here in the States in over 30 years. So one thing that's really surprising is that we don't have a startup visa for a lot of exciting startup tech companies. And that stands in contrast to tons of other countries. So I had an opportunity to provide written testimony to Congress in a hearing that they had in relation to the outdated immigration system, where I actually could firsthand storytell, or secondhand through clients of mine, about their experiences and about what it would be like, or why the system could be better. Doing things like writing op-eds for national newspapers here. I wrote one for USA that was published in USA Today in relation to work permits for foreign students. During the Trump administration, there were four Republican senators that were trying to remove, get rid of the ability for foreign students to work upon graduation. And that's something that's extremely near and dear to my heart, because I came from, as an international student, I actually first came to Chicago through UCD through an exchange program, for which I will forever be grateful. But when I came back the second time to do my Juris Doctor, I was here on a student visa, and I finished and got a work permit. And so there was a narrative out there that said, specifically in the letter, the senators had said, there is no reason why these foreign students, international students, should take away jobs from Americans, was essentially the narrative. I read that letter and I was like fuming. I said, what do you mean there's no reason? There's, thousands of reasons. And so I sat down and I was writing, I spent, you see an op-ed that's 800 words, and you think someone can just sit down and pop that out in, an hour. It took me probably 40 hours to write such a short, I was agonizing over every word. And as all the writers here can attest, it almost takes longer to write a shorter piece because you have to be so thoughtful of every word. But the end result was an op-ed that did get published in USA Today. But I said, here are all the reasons, and I contacted one of my startup clients, a Turkish entrepreneur who was here as a foreign student, Murda Ziri. He set up this healthcare technology company called SwipeSense. The whole goal of the company is to combat the spread of hospital-acquired infections. This is years pre-COVID. They have software and hardware to track in hospital system. It was just so innovative and fantastic. It's an amazing company. And it got acquired last year by SC Johnson and Company. But I asked Mert, would he be okay with me including his story in this piece? And he said, yeah, go for it. So I popped a bit about him in there and was able to just articulate, these are all the reasons, and I think using our experience, our platform of privilege, like the knowledge that we have, and finding a way to kind of to share those stories, but with a real sense of advocacy, I think is what we can do. And we can see that it can make a difference. It's made a difference in lots of different situations with DACA here, with the earlier iterations of the Muslim ban, so I think that that's a really rewarding piece as well, is like the bigger picture advocacy and having that sense of optimism and maybe persistence as well, that things can be better and it can get better. And if we keep trying, we might be able to play a role in making that happen.
It's incredible to be able to use those stories, to use that influence, through contributions to newspapers and so on, to be able to influence the discourse, and that in turn can influence policy, as you have in that way, and make such a tremendous impact. Katrina, if I could turn back to you for a moment. You just a moment ago, you mentioned the very personal and compelling nature of your writing, and you really do have a remarkable skill in harnessing personal stories and turning them into compelling narratives to simulate change and action. In your work as a human rights investigator, an advocate, a journalist, an author, you've drawn attention for a long period of time to the plight of overlooked and marginalized people, mostly women. Do you believe that sharing our personal stories can help drive change and help empower survivors to find justice and healing?
I do very powerfully. I think stories can change lives, and I think they can save lives. I've obviously seen that on a professional level through working with Mary on the climate justice book, and then also on a personal level with my memoir. Beginning with Mary, the book that we wrote together, Climate Justice, came out of Mary's frustration at sitting, around conference tables at these high-level meetings, the COPs for climate change, and noticing that the meetings were full of mostly men, but men speaking in very technical, high-level language, and women were not at the table, but also those who were experiencing the real effects of climate change were not at the table. So Mary used her platform and her position to bring people to the table. So Indigenous groups, women, those who are working around the world to confront the effects of climate change. And that had never been done before. And the change at these meetings when these real experts, those who are living the experience, came and sat there and told their stories and spoke truth to power was remarkable. And that's why we wrote that book together. It's a storytelling book. Each chapter profiles a person, people from all around the world. There were stories from America, from Africa, from Australia, from in the Indian Ocean, all around the world, giving their lived experience. And that has had a profound impact on subsequent global climate negotiations and legislation. And then just from my own experience, obviously I mentioned my memoir, An Affair with My Mother. And when I wrote the book, I was writing essentially just for one audience member, and that was my birth mother, Sarah. It seems strange. I never actually expected that anyone else would read the book. And it was a deeply personal endeavor and a very difficult one. And when I put the book out into the world, I was astonished in the days and weeks after the memoir was published that I was inundated with messages, social media messages, emails, letters from people who were telling me, this is my experience. You know, I can't believe you called your book An Affair with My Mother, because I'm having an affair with my mother. You know, I'm a secret child. And other women who had to give up their children for adoption were writing to me saying, I am that secret mother. I am unable to bring my child into the light. And it was completely unexpected and overwhelming and almost terrifying, because people were sharing their precious, intimate stories with me, and I was now the keeper of their secrets. So I wrote to everyone who wrote to me, which was another gift because this correspondence began. But I guess the common thread to this experience and to those who wrote to me was shame. My book is about secrecy and shame and the legacy in Ireland towards our unconscionable treatment of so-called unmarried mothers. And I wanted, as a daughter and as a journalist, to investigate that shame and to bring it to light. And I thought a lot about Brené Brown, who's a well-known academic here in the US, and she talks about shame a lot. That's one of her subjects of investigation, but she says that shame needs 3 ingredients to survive, and that's secrecy, silence, and judgment. And I think certainly from my own personal experience in Ireland, you know, secrecy, silence, and judgment in terms of the forced adoption and closed adoption system is alive and well. But Brené Brown also says that shame can be eradicated by empathy and by sharing our stories. So I think really, you know, those people writing to me, sharing their stories with me, collectively working together, there's been a lot of activism since then on adoption legislation and on the access to records and on the mother and baby home situation. Somehow that's helped, I think, break the silence a little bit and chip away at the shame. And I'm not saying that it was my work that did that. I just collectively, people coming out of the shadows to talk about these issues. We're not very good about talking about shame or about Ireland's legacy of historical abuse, particularly towards women. So that's been very, very gratifying. So I think just, you know, short answer to your question, Joe, is that stories can change lives.
I think your story is an incredibly compelling and intimate one, which has clearly resonated with so many people. And you clearly have contributed in such an important way to the discourse in that area. Ivanna, if I could welcome you, happy International Women's Day. You have been campaigning, Ivanna, for a fairer Ireland since your early days as a student activist, and you've been ahead of the curve on much of the significant social change which Ireland has experienced over the past 3 decades and counting. Almost 20 years ago, you wrote about your frustration, I think I could call it that, your frustration at the slow pace of change, arguing that Ireland had to be dragged kicking and screaming to support progressive causes. But since then, Ireland has, amongst other things, voted in favour of marriage equality and abortion rights, human rights issues that must have seemed unthinkable 20 years ago. How was that scale of change achieved in such a short period of time? Were these campaigns also driven by the power of personal stories? And how do we capture that momentum to continue to pursue human rights issues?
Well, no pressure with those questions there, Joe. Thank you. And thank you for the kind invitation to be here. And apologies that I'm tuning in late and have to leave early because I just got a rake of different International Women's Day events. But it's a real pleasure to be here and to be alongside, to speak alongside Fiona and Katrina, who I'm a great admirer of, both of you. And I suppose just to say, first of all, I mean, as I think all of us would acknowledge that, you know, we're here in a peaceful country at the edge of Europe, and, you know, we're conscious that at the other edge of Europe, there's a country that is absolutely beleaguered and being bombarded by Russian troops and tanks. So just to stand in solidarity with the people of Ukraine. And on International Women's Day, as we're celebrating rightly the achievements of women, it's horrifying to watch women and children fleeing across borders in 2022 in Europe. So just to acknowledge that. Yes, we have changed immensely in Ireland, and thank you very much for the kind words, Joe. Certainly my favourite headline after my by-election win last summer was "Overnight Success After 30 Years," which kind of summed up my political career, because yes, I had been, you know, toiling away, campaigning away for a long time on issues that didn't seem to be getting any political purchase. And it was remarkable to me, as somebody who's now, you know, in my 50s with teenage daughters of my own, it's remarkable to me to see how swiftly change came when it started coming. And there's lots, you know, lots has been written, and I've written some as well, about how that has happened. I think you're absolutely right, and Katrina's illustrated it just there, the power of the personal story, the personal narrative, the lived experience, and that has been hugely instrumental in creating change in Ireland. And we saw it, of course, in 2015 when marriage equality, when we really, you know, made sure that a lot of the campaign was about telling stories. And then again in 2018 with the repeal referendum. But, you know, I did a book a couple of years ago with Mary Rogan, my Trinity colleague, Legal Cases That Changed Ireland. And what we were looking at actually was how litigants have used personal stories and in order to launch legal cases. They haven't won them in many cases, but they have, through the cases, helped to shape change. So, you know, this book grew out of my own interest. I was a practicing barrister for many years and acted for Catherine Zappone and the late and much beloved Anne Louise Gilligan in their action against the state seeking recognition of the right to marry. And of course, that was the case, the Zappone-Gilligan case, which lost in the High Court. You know, we went down in flames, but legally speaking, but politically, the advocacy around the case, the fact that Catherine and Anne Louise's story was told in many public fora around the case, that really helped to generate support first for civil partnership law and then, of course, for marriage equality. So I suppose the lesson I would take from human rights campaigning over many years is that personal stories have to be front and centre, but also use that, you know, we need to use every tool at our disposal, and litigation, public interest litigation, as we call it in law, is a very powerful tool in itself, but only if it is being conducted alongside an advocacy campaign to change hearts and minds from the bottom up, because, you know, we've seen change that is top down often not really becoming embedded, whereas if we have grassroots campaigning, storytelling alongside litigation, that can really help to change things. And finally, not to be afraid of incremental change. For many of us, you know, it was very difficult to accept that as far as we could get at one point with the marriage campaign, for example, was civil partnership, which fell short of marriage. And yet, looking back, the fact that we passed law on civil partnership certainly helped to move us towards a position where marriage equality was possible, because the sky did not fall in, you know, for those who were opposed. And similarly with abortion, I mean, there were many who were very critical of the law we brought in, the Protection of Life During Pregnancy Act, which is now repealed. But it was a piece of legislation that was the first time the Oireachtas in 2013 had grasped the actual responsibility of legislating to protect women's lives. It was a very narrow, very conservative law, but it was a huge step forward, and it certainly paved the way for the much greater change and repeal in 2018. So, you know, I'm somebody who's always argued about working constructively and collaboratively on a cross-party basis. If you can't achieve the radical change you desire immediately, you'll be able to achieve it through incremental steps, but you must bring people with you. And that's where the personal stories come in again. Thank you.
That's great. Fiona, if I could bring you back in on this, you've also successfully drawn on the power of narratives in your work, not least in your children's book, Our American Dream. And you've emphasized representation for immigrants and generated empathy, much like our other panelists have talked about through that work. And that work, I think, continues or has added resonance in light of an increased anti-immigrant sentiment in the US during the Trump administration, sentiment which resulted in policies that directly impacted women, children and families, like the notorious family separation policy at the southern border. And in more recent times, The world has witnessed horrific events in Afghanistan and the Ukraine, and narratives of those fleeing conflict have also provoked important policy discussions. From your own work in immigration cases, how do we work to ensure that race and gender don't interact to become multipliers of injustice?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. And I just want to echo first what Ivanna was saying about using litigation in combination with narratives and how powerful that can be. And before I chat brief about Afghanistan and Ukraine, I just wanted to give one example in the US that we saw that was specifically, I feel like, was able to marry both of those things. And that's in relation to DACA, which you may have heard of, but that is the protection that the Obama administration brought in for the Dreamers. So people who were brought here as children and ended up undocumented. And I also think what Ireland has done recently in relation to undocumented immigrants and Ukraine, I hopefully will get to mention that, has been, I think, a great example for other countries. But in relation to DACA, that case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And actually, one of the things that the Supreme Court justices mentioned was the impact that getting rid of DACA would have on all the people that had it. And there was a massive grassroots campaign here by DACA beneficiaries getting out there, sharing their story. They have been advocating. They were the ones who ended up getting DACA to begin with. And I had a limited series podcast, and I interviewed Belen Sisa, who worked for, she was the Latinx press secretary or press communications for the Bernie Sanders campaign, a DACA recipient herself. But, she was telling stories about how, the pressure that was put on the Obama administration to get DACA. And then when they got DACA, the fact that, people were trying to get rid of it, the Trump administration was trying to stop it. And there were all these stories, there were all these narratives of this is, all these companies came together as well. And we saw, the big companies submit briefs in support of DACA. And then the Supreme Court basically said, you can't just ignore the reliance that all these hundreds of thousands, millions of people have placed on this program. And to do so would be illegal against, you disregarded their interests and there was no consideration given. And that just shows you how powerful that is. That the Supreme Court here in the US said that by disregarding all these narratives and all these stories and the reliance that it would have and the children, the US born children of these people, you can see how them sharing their stories actually helped influence a Supreme Court decision. So it is really, really possible. And then, the children's book that I had, I mentioned one of Dreamers in there. There was all different kind of, there was short stories for children, but I wrote it because I felt like the narrative around immigration and immigrants was so hurtful and so false during the Trump administration that people were consuming this, and also the media that we consume and how we hear about immigrants can actually directly influence how we think about immigrants. And there's a great nonprofit here called Define American that is led by Jose Antonio Vargas. He's an award-winning journalist who's undocumented. He has been an amazing activist, but they do stories on how media representation, or even in TV and film, how we consume that really influences how we think about immigrants. So if we're only seeing storylines where immigrants are criminalized and getting deported, well, when we think about immigration, we're immediately, our brain is immediately going to, oh, immigrants bad, getting deported, they're criminals, and his thing is we need to be more accurately depicting how immigrants are in their day-to-day lives. And that's a tiny percent of immigration. So let's share some of these other stories. And they work to accurately, depict immigrant representation in media. And I think it's really important. And then obviously to talk about family separation, which was absolutely horrific. And I think the work that people did, the sharing of the stories, those photos, those images that we saw, they were so compelling. And the world was, that was talk about human rights violations. It was what they did to those families, the lasting trauma that can go through generations based on that separation was just horrific. And I think, some members of the Irish, some Irish politicians really spoke out against that as well. And I have a lot of respect for people who did that too, because, maybe it's not easy to go against the US, but I think that was done and it was very effective too. And I think we'll never hopefully ever see that again. But to what's going on right now in Ukraine and Afghanistan, I mean, I think, you know, my heart goes out to everybody. I think Ivanna did a great job of just kind of giving solidarity. And I think we have to acknowledge what's happening there. It is absolutely horrific. And what happened in Afghanistan was horrendous as well. Our firm did a ton of pro bono cases trying to get people out of the US, and also tried to harness like storytelling in a way that we could. It was difficult, but we did it through family members who were here in the US. And I will say that the response from the US government was not what we were hoping it would be, to be honest, to be totally honest, was not at all. And I think, you know, maybe in contrast, we did recently just see last week, Ukraine has been granted temporary protected status here. So that means people who were here in the US from Ukraine on a certain day last week may be able to get a stay of deportation and a work permit. But it also, that has brought up a bigger conversation as well of like, who's deserving of TPS? There's a big campaign to get TPS for the Cameroon. And there's examples of how that country also meets the requirements for TPS. And I think it's important when we look at protection for people that we're looking across the board as well, and that we're really looking at the treatment. AILA's president, Alan Orr, an African-American fantastic advocate, talks about the mistreatment of Black migrants as well in the US, and there's a disparity there as well. So I think that these are all, you know, really important topical conversations that we need to be having. And a friend of mine wrote an op-ed yesterday about who's deserving of protection and you know, humane treatment in the US, and it's all migrants, right? And so I think that using these narratives and having, you know, using our platform to advocate for this, we really can get change. And I think that obviously we need more change, but I'm happy with at least what happens with TPS. There's more permanent solutions that we need. And I just want to applaud again what Ireland has done. I think removing visa requirements and really opening the door, and the people of Ireland as well. I mean, it's been heartwarming to see and it's been happening in the US too. But I mean, I think I'm always so proud to see the response of people at home, and it just makes me extra proud to be Irish in times like this.
Thank you, Fiona. If I could open up this discussion to all of you and ask you all maybe the same question. You know, each of you have worked to elevate the rights of women in very different ways and areas, again, through work on reproductive rights or refugee rights and climate change and so on. But what initially spurred each of you down these paths? Who influenced you? Who are your role models? Who helped you reach your goals? Ivanna, if I could start with you on that question.
Thank you very much, Joe, and it's been really great to listen to the others. Unfortunately, I'll have to go in a few minutes because I have to be at another event, but we have actually Dáil's statements today as well on International Women's Day, so I'll be speaking on those later. Well, you know, it's a big question, who inspired us all, certainly, and we've been talking about mothers. Well, my mother is remains my biggest inspiration. You know, she's a staunch feminist and a great activist, and when we were growing up in Cork, where I grew up before we moved to Dublin, she was involved there with feminist movement around contraceptive rights, and used to give out condoms on the quays side of Cork with her sisters and her co-activists. So my mum remains a great inspiration, really, you know. But I was lucky enough to go to Trinity and to the law school there. No offence, I know this is UCD law, but of course in the 80s, in late 80s, and I was a student, we had Mary Robinson, we had Mary McAleese, we had just wonderful role models, you know, and women who were really playing a large role in public life as well as teaching law. So they were also great, and again remain great role models for me. So I think it's really important, obviously, that we have powerful role models for young women and girls, and that we see women taking centre stage, and because of course if you can't be it, you can't see it, as we all know. But I was lucky enough to have quite a number of great women in my life, and remain lucky. So thank you, and apologies again, I'll have to slip off shortly.
That's great. We won't hold the Trinity affiliation against you, Ivanna, so that's okay. Katrina, if I could ask you the same question, who influenced you and who helped you reach your goals?
Well, because it is a UCD event, I have to talk about the late, wonderful Sister Margaret McCurtain, who was, or Mags as she was known fondly to her students. You know, she single-handedly rewrote women into Ireland's history, and just on a a personal level, she took, huge interest in many of her students and was very kind to me and, urged me to reach high, really urged me to apply for this Fulbright that I came to the US on, but most importantly, taught me to speak up. I'm notoriously soft-spoken, and Mags was really once, a bit irritated with me when I presented a paper and gave me a lecture about speaking up, and she meant that in a wider sense, and I've always carried that with me. Obviously, Mary Robinson has been a huge influence on me. It's been an amazing dream to work with her and just to be inspired by someone who at this point could be sitting back and resting after a pretty remarkable career, but she is literally fighting for our collective survival. And I am so in awe of her. And, at UCD, there are remarkable women. I'm thinking of the UCD's Education Rights Network, who are very dear to my heart. And if there are students on today, please seek them out, because they are doing remarkable work for the institution and for young people in Ireland. And going back to Ivanna's point earlier about the importance of advocacy, but advocacy combined with campaigning. I have been in awe for many, many years of women in Ireland. I'm thinking of Maeve O'Rourke and Claire McGettrick, also of UCD and UCG, who started the Clan group, and Justice for Magdalenes. Professor Jim Smith at Boston College, the greatest feminist I know. These people are academic activists, and they're working to elevate Ireland's historical abuses and to share stories and to not just that, but really rewrite legislation and give redress and justice for survivors. And I guess my family, I grew up in a house that revered education, and I was the first person in my family to go to university. I'm deeply indebted to my parents, but particularly to my dad, who I think he's watching today, but he's helped me navigate the world with kindness and gentleness and to see empathy and compassion in everyone. So I'm very indebted to him.
Thank you, Katrina. I think your message has a lot of resonance for us educators, maybe, who are also on this call, that we remain cognizant of the role that we can play in our students' lives. Fiona, if I could turn to you and ask you again the same question.
Hi, Ivanna.
And apologies, Joe, I'll have to go, but thank you very much for including me today. Thank you.
No,
Happy
Hi.
International Women's Day.
You could.
Same.
Thank you. Fiona, if I could ask you that question again, sorry. Who influenced you? Who helped you achieve your goals?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to kind of echo what Katrina mentioned there. I'm the first in my family as well to go to university, and my parents, I think, always wished they could have got that opportunity, but they, from Irish families, my dad was the eldest of a big family. They both went to the civil service, so they never got that opportunity, but always impressed on me the importance of education as well. And I think, we used to always have these very spirited discussions around the, family table. And my dad's nickname for me has been Save the Whales, actually, from when I was a kid. He always called me that. We used to have, pretty lively debates about, climate issues or the rights of like union workers, whatever it was. And my mum as well. I mean, just a brief story about her recently. She actually called up Joe Duffy. It was around the time of the election, and like she wouldn't be used to doing public speaking or anything, but she was listening to Joe Duffy and she got so upset there was somebody on talking about, it was around the time of the re-election of Trump, and she was listening and her blood was boiling, and she said, I'm picking up the phone. So she picked up the phone, and next thing you know, she's on Joe Duffy. And, I was so proud of her. It made me realize, she was sharing stories. She was saying, my kids are over there. My brother works with me as a partner in my firm. He's also a UCD grad. But she's like, my kids are over there, and you wouldn't believe, talking about the family separation and all sorts of things. And, you know, I know it was scary for her to do that. She wasn't used to doing things like that, but she did such an amazing job, and she spoke out and she stood up for what was right. And I think she's always taught me that it might not always be easy, but we do have a voice, and and we can use it to make things better. And so yeah, so that was just, and the reason I'm thinking about that is this man I know in Chicago sent me a text. He's like, is that your mother on Joe Duffy? You know, it's like, you can't do anything, you know, in Chicago, someone here in the suburbs heard my mum on Joe Duffy, but it's things like that, you know, speaking out and being able to use your voice. And also my big group of immigration lawyers, there's a lot of women practicing in immigration law, and I've seen so many people before me, and I'm constantly inspired by my colleagues as well. So yeah.
I would never underestimate the power of the Irish mammy, especially with the mouthpiece of with the profile and platform of Joe Duffy.
Absolutely.
One final question for you both, because I know we've run out of time effectively. But if I could ask you, and Fiona, we might stay with you for a moment on this, and then I'll turn to Katrina. If I could ask you what advice you would give to those coming next, maybe to our UCD students, how they could get the most out of their studies, out of work in this area, in your area, in immigration law and so on. And maybe what message more generally that you might have, that you might want to share with all of our attendees on International Women's Day.
Yeah, I mean, so as far as for students, I mean, now is the opportunity to really explore as many things as you can. And I think it's as much about learning what you don't like as what you do. You've great opportunities to really like immerse yourselves in lots of different areas of law. And also the path in law, you know, it doesn't always have to be law, you know, to then practicing as a lawyer. I mean, there can be so many different areas, and this is no matter what you're studying as well. I think it's just to have an open mind, to look around. And a lot of what I do is like media and writing in addition to practicing law. And so, you know, you can, you know, you can have a hybrid, I think, as well. There's a lot more flexibility now. And I think exploring everything to see what you do like and what you don't like, it's a great opportunity now. And in kind of in a more general sense, I think the pandemic has just shown us that really we don't know what's around the corner. You know, life can be really short. There's so many people have lost so many, you know, people, and just lost so much. And I think that, you know, a lot of us have taken this opportunity to really take stock and just kind of reassess priorities as well. And I think that we do spend a lot of our time working, no matter what you do. It's like a large portion of, you know, our lives. And I think it's important that we're doing something that fulfills us, you know, and I think I feel very privileged that the work that I do really, really fulfills me. And it's not always easy. I think I would be lying if I said, you know, every day, everything, you know, it's stressful, it's tough, it's challenging, it's rewarding, it's all those things together. And that's okay. You know, it doesn't always have to be easy. But it is rewarding. And I think that that's my big takeaway, is that if you can do something that is rewarding and has purpose, I think, you know, that's I think all we can hope for, really.
And Katrina, if I could turn to you and give you the last word on this, you know, what message would you share on
I think Fiona is so spot on, and so I endorse everything that she's just said. And you know, I think this is a really tough time for students. University students, elementary, secondary students. I've seen the effects of the pandemic on my own 3 kids, and you know, the difficulties of navigating education and virtual learning. So I just think it's a really tough time, much tougher than any cohort of students. And I think I would say not to be afraid of the non-linear path. You know, I've jumped around a lot in my career. I've had many different hats, but I think the one thing that has, you know, kept me, the one common thread has been you know, this love of storytelling and a desire for justice and truth telling. And I think as long as you're following your heart, you're totally fine. And that's very cliched to say that. And it's easy when you have to pay bills. But I just think, you know, staying true to yourself and following what you love, what makes you tick, what makes you happy, and what makes you content is really, really important. And also, I just remember Samantha Power, who's the former US ambassador to the United Nations. We were friends when we were students, and the war in Bosnia had just occurred, and I desperately wanted to be there, and I desperately wanted to work in human rights. And there was one organization that I really, really, really wanted to work for, but they had no jobs. And Sam looked at me and she said, well, have you gone over there? Have you knocked on their door? And I said, well, you know, of course I had knocked on their door. Like, that's an absurd thing to do. And she said, well, get your resume, print it out. This is when you printed resumes, and just go over there. So I did that, and I knocked on their door, and I went in and I met with them, and lo and behold, I got a job. And that's a silly, small example, but it's about pursuing, you know, what you want to do. So be brave, knock on doors, you know, show up, and believe in yourself.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Katrina. I can see from the comments coming in that, you know, both your contributions have really connected with people. We have one question, if it's okay to keep you another 2 minutes. We have a question from the floor, from the Q&A, from our audience. Have either of you had a female mentor in your careers so far? If yes, do you have any advice on how to find one? Open to either of you to answer that one.
I've had a few. I mean, not necessarily immigration specific, but I've had one, because I moved to the US, I didn't have a network of people. So I joined the Women's Bar Association of Illinois, and I met some amazing female mentors and friends. My friend Carrie Valentino, she's a practicing litigator, and she was a few years ahead of me in terms of like kids and you know, career. And so I relied on her for like a lot of different things in terms of schooling advice, or, you know, that type of stuff, and developing a professional network as well. And a lot of men as well have been great mentors to me too. As far as I've also, I think, been able to mentor. I mentor my team and other people who come to me. I would say, don't be afraid to reach out to people. I mean, obviously we get a lot of unsolicited things on LinkedIn and so on and so forth. But I think if you are sincere, and if you can send somebody a message with like a distinct, you know, hey, I know you're probably busy, but is there any way I could have a 15-minute Zoom with you or something like that? And I think if you're specific, and if you are sincere, and if you share why or something like that, I think that it's very rare. Well, for me, when I get those things, then I will make 15 minutes for somebody to talk to them. And so I think that don't be afraid. I think, like Katrina said, be brave, and kind of this is maybe the 2022 equivalent of putting your resume under the door, is like reaching out through social media with, I think, specifics, and I think that that's a great way to find somebody. Or also networking. I mean, for the past 15-20 years have been going to so many different events. I've met a lot of people by developing sincere connections, and now that we're coming out of the pandemic, hopefully, or at least we're starting to do some in-person things, there's more opportunities for that. So I would say, you know, look at those opportunities that are there, because face-to-face is a great way to develop those relationships too.
Yeah,
Katrina.
I would agree. I mean, I have many mentors. I'm always looking for mentors. I'm always wanting to learn from people. You know, going back to sharing stories, it's really important to have that connection. And yes, I would just totally agree with Fiona. Just reach out, think about who you admire, who would bring something to your life, and just reach out. Don't be shy. Don't be like me. Don't be shy. Just, you know, ask for their help, and you'll be amazed and humbled at how kind people are, and how much they have to offer.
Thank you both so much for that. I'm conscious we ran perhaps a tiny bit over time, but I really want to thank you, our panelists today. My sincere thanks to Fiona, Katrina, and of course Ivanna, who joined us earlier. My thanks also to the college principal, and to our great events people in the college, John, Emma, and Lola, without whom this would not have been possible. And of course, thank you all for attending. Thank you. Happy International Women's Day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.